So my paper is entitled The Invisible Radicals, How Leftist Politics Shaped Maidan and Went Unnoticed, which I understand is a kind of strong title, so you can see if you agree with me or not by the end of the paper. Many discussions have recognized the complexity present throughout the Maidan mobilizations, but one essential group of participants has so far been ignored: the Ukrainian far left. Organized leftist columns participated in every aspect of Maidan. They were present from the first inklings of protest. They were often the targets of attacks based on their posters and banners promoting tolerance and equality, free transportation, education, and healthcare, and transparency and accountability in government. But leftists were also central organizers in multiple Maidan-based initiatives, the most prominent being the Student Assembly and subsequent occupation of the Ministry of Education. This paper will discuss how leftist groups responded to shifting attitudes on Maidan to go from being marginal participants against whom violence was acceptable to being central players in several essential and broadly supported initiatives. I will suggest that there are two reasons for the erasure of leftist voices on Maidan. One is the focus on far right-wing groups and their potential to influence the future of Ukrainian politics. This is not to say that these groups should be ignored. Rather, I suggest that the studies of the right must also recognize that a left exists in a given context in order for the right to have meaning. The radical right and radical left have shaped each other since before Maidan, but because of the advancement of several prominent right-wing organizations on Maidan, the mainstream media has focused exclusively on the radical right. Academics have largely ignored the participation of leftists, which may be because leftist participation was not as visible as right-wing participation, but it may also simply not occur to researchers to study such groups in a critical way because of their small size and relatively non-threatening position to Ukrainian governmental institutions. However, the relationship between the right and left must be recognized in order for those designations to have meaning. The second reason leftist groups have been ignored is that internal disagreements among the role of leftists on Maidan means that there is no united leftist front to present to media or researchers. There's not even a single agreed-upon definition of what the left is and what leftists should do in Ukraine. This paper considers the contributions of self-identified leftists to Maidan without suggesting that they represent any kind of unified left. In other words, I use the term leftist because my interlocutors use this term. Both they and I recognize that leftism is itself very complicated, and these leftists are constantly engaged with the changing definitions of the left. I use the example of left-identified activist participation on Maidan to complicate the picture of Maidan and to attempt to place these activists within a broader picture of a social movement on the margins of Europe. Current forms of leftism, usually enacted by young political activists who are often students, are included with an association of the left with communism, making the contemporary Ukrainian context a challenging and often dangerous place to be an overtly leftist person. In other words, it is easy to condemn the current left because it is not distinguished from state socialism in the minds of most people, even though most of today's young leftists do not support an imagined return to the Soviet Union or even participation in Russia's customs union. But, as others have noted, Maidan was not just nationalist, but anti-communist at its heart, and many participants saw the mobilizations and the overthrow of Yanukovych as the final step in freeing Ukraine from Russian and Soviet tethers. Any possible representation of communism, including contemporary leftist slogans and ideas, was unwelcome on Maidan, particularly in the beginning of the mobilizations. As leftists are almost always associated with communism, their initial presence on Maidan was condemned and even attacked. Despite their criticisms of overt displays of nationalism, leftist activists used the massive mobilizations on Maidan to express their ideas as well, tentatively recognizing the importance of leftist participation in what might become a mass movement because of the possibility to use it as a platform for their own ideas. As November came to a close, leftist activists used mass marches as a space to present their campaign for free municipal transportation, free and accessible education, and a world without borders. These ideas were more or less ignored, however, because they appeared alongside slogans about equality, tolerance, and feminism, which not only drew attention away from economic campaigns like transport and education, but there were also several direct attacks on those people holding the signs with the latter themes. Activists promoting feminism and against homophobia were attacked with lead pipes and pepper spray, and they were continually verbally abused by many passersby as well as protesters. Following these attacks, leftist participants recognized the problems associated with this kind of presence on Maidan. Despite the extremely antagonistic atmosphere, leftist activists continued to be present, but much of their focus turned to ideas about self-organizing and nonpartisan politics. The ideas of self-organizing became a more viable solution as opposition candidates increasingly proved themselves to be unable to satisfy protesters' demands. Leftist ideas became even more essential to Maidan after the night of the 30th of November, when slogans among non-leftists largely condemned Yanukovych for beating the protesters on the square. But here, leftists began to assert their relevance because instead of simply blaming one person for the violence, the leftists were already well-versed in language critical of a police state, and they linked this language to the Yanukovych regime. This allowed them to fit into criticisms of Yanukovych, but with a broader language that condemned more than just the president, but the entire system holding him up. Other protesters on Maidan responded positively to language about human rights and nonviolence presented by leftists at mass marches throughout December. And at a march early in the month, the leftist groups hung a huge banner with the slogan, "We are against a police state," on Maidan, and this banner was later appropriated and relocated to the occupied city hall, where it was flanked somewhat ironically by opposition banners. The role of this shift in language may not be recognized as a leftist move in itself. However, the notion of self-organizing and standing against state violence led to leftist-influenced developments that otherwise would not have been possible. For example, after the occupation of the Ukrainian house in late January, students claimed a space in the building. This space, known as Student Assembly, was used as a meeting point for general assemblies at which students pursued various campaigns through working groups, like picketing courts and supporting economic boycotts of oligarch-owned companies. The students worked with other organizers in the Ukrainian house to schedule lectures and film screenings, which were attended by activists and protesters of all backgrounds. After the new transition government was decided and the president began to name a cabinet, students occupied the Ministry of Education for 1 week at the end of February. Like the Ukrainian house and city hall occupations, the students had a medical point, a kitchen, places to sleep, and their own self-defense brigade who guarded the gates and only let student card holders into the building. At the ministry, they held massive student assemblies, elected a presidium to represent students, chose 3 student-approved candidates for minister, and created a roadmap of demands for the improvements of higher education. When Serhiy Kvit was named the new minister and the ministry reopened for work, students meticulously opened each office in turn, followed by a live stream, showing that they had not damaged any possessions or stolen any documents during their occupation. By February 28th, Serhiy Kvit accepted the students' roadmap. The student occupation of the Ministry of Education presents an interesting conundrum for leftists on Maidan. While its success was clearly based on progressive ideas like self-organization, transparency, accessibility, and consensus, and while the leftist student union was prominent in organizing and supporting the occupation, many students present identified with right-leaning and nationalist ideas. Serhiy Kvit was not the first or the second choice of leftist groups for minister, as he is known for his nationalist ideas and often condemnatory attitude toward active leftists and leftist spaces. While he has certainly been amenable to student demands in his early days in office, whether he will continue with these progressive actions remains a concern for leftists. And many leftist student activists have considered the adoption of Law 11872 on higher education to be a success, but others are not fully satisfied with these legislative changes as they do not represent systematic changes in the governance of Ukraine. It is unclear whether leftist students who participated in the Ministry of Occupation can and should consider their realization of their demands as a success for the left. That a tactically radical move, like occupying a government building, continued until students elected to leave the building, suggests significant student support from left and non-left identified students. On one hand, this has brought student issues to the forefront of the new minister's concerns, and student issues have been a central focus of leftist organizations in Ukraine, largely because many of these leftists are students themselves. On the other hand, the broad support of the ministry occupation and the participation of multiple organizations has meant that the possible influence of leftist activists has been minimized because their political identification marginalizes them. Considering the latter, is it effective for leftists to continue to participate in a movement in which, no matter how essential they are in its organization, their fundamental ideas are constantly devalued? Maidan did not give leftists an opportunity to solidify themselves as a unified political voice that could be presented as a counter to the radical right. The mainstreaming of right-wing attitudes is not balanced by a mainstreaming of leftist ideas, and it is even possible that leftists will be even more marginalized than they were before Maidan because of the wider acceptance of right-wing and anti-Soviet stances. Education-based activism continues to be the one place that leftists have seen success, which is in part because this sphere does not demand a radical restructuring of institutions, but instead considers legislative change a success. But other social changes suggested by leftists are not taken seriously by mainstream political institutions. Some leftists have been attempting to build party-like structures in order to gain representation in the Kyiv City Council, for example, but these attempts have seen little electoral success. It seems to me that there is a growing distinction among leftists who think that political representation counts as a success and leftists who do not. And as the aftermath of Maidan becomes the consolidation of a new government through several elections, the particularities of smaller political organizations with little representation, such as these leftist groups, gets lost. And as studies of the radical right become more expansive and more necessary, I suggest that tracking these possible paths of leftist groups should be a parallel engagement for scholars concerned about the current situation, so we can honestly represent the multitude of political voices present in Ukraine today. Thank you.